Hey everyone, it's Jordan here,
And I'm Maya.
and today we'll be discussing why the Menendez brothers feared their parents.
This is part two of a two-part series on psychological maltreatment. In our previous episode, we covered Kitty's abuse, and this is the second half on Jose's abuse. Trigger warning for this episode, we'll be discussing psychological and emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and animal abuse.
Okay, well, we thought like a good way to start this off is to sort of give you guys a pretty good overview of what the family system was like.
The family system was run as what's typically referred to as like a narcissist's family, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you have like one main abuser or a narcissist, which in this case is Jose, and like the children sort of take on different roles in the eyes of the narcissist. So Lyle was Jose's golden child because he was going to be a better version of Jose.
Yeah, he was like the heir apparent, right?
Yeah. And so Jose focused a lot of his attention on Lyle in terms of like training him and creating him into this golden child. On the other hand, Erik was the scapegoat or sort of the throwaway child in Jose's eyes, where he didn't receive that kind of attention, was just sort of there as an object, really. Although, I think both brothers were viewed as objects by Jose, but sort of in different ways. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd say so. Because, like, for Jose, what he was really doing was sort of molding Lyle to be his, like, to be like an extension of himself, really. Whereas Erik was more a tool, like a more of like a literal object, but it's still viewing them as objects, just in different ways. Both of them, at the end of the day, are there to serve Jose's needs, not the other way around. I know, like, you've read Paul Mohn's books, right? Which is about parasite cases. What's the name of the book?
It's called When a Child Kills. I definitely recommend it for anyone who's interested in this case. I found it really insightful, and I think Paul Mohn's take on the cases that he worked on, that he wrote about, really give an insight into like how the parents view the children and how the child views the parent, and like this whole idea of the family system is really captured really well. We can talk about it in another episode because there's been some speculation by some people that the brothers took their stories of abuse from this book, which, having read the book, doesn't make any sense to me. There's really not a ton of similarities, but we can go into that another time. In the intro to the book, there's a section that talks about how parents who are abusive to the extent that their children kill them, how those parents view their children. So I wanted to read that section because I think it definitely applies to how Jose viewed his children. So it says, most of these parents recognize no boundary between themselves and their children. For them, their son or daughter is an extra limb or just another object that belongs to them, like a piece of furniture. They perceive the act of conception as granting them absolute, unfettered control over the life they have created. Their child exists solely to satisfy their needs and desires, and thus is raised to have no independent identity. A psychiatrist friend once described the primary difference between what, for lack of a better term, might be called the typically physically or verbally abusive parent, and the parent who dies by the hand of his child. The former beats or belittles her child because she has an honest, albeit misguided, belief that it is the appropriate way to reform or control the child's behavior. The second parent doesn't care about reforming the child's behavior. Instead, he is addicted to his power over the child and the pleasure derived from exercising it.
I think that is very apt. I really want to read the book myself, actually.
You definitely should. I think he captures really well why it's important to have a complete picture of the family when you're evaluating cases like this, because he talks a lot about how incidents that happened a long time in the past can be really formative to an adult or an older child's brain and how they view their relationship with their parents and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to think of when it comes to this case. And as we will be discussing why the Menendez brothers actually feared their parents, you have to sort of take into consideration the entire picture of the family. Like, it's one thing to look at an individual incident, but to understand why the child would have the fear of the parent, you need to take into account the entire lifetime of events that sort of all culminate into this fear of the parent, which is very important in this case. It's a big part of the defense, and is also a big part of the defense that was, let's just say, objected to a lot in the second trial. But yeah.
Yeah. So another thing that Paul Mones brought up in the book was he talked about like family systems where the child kills both parents. Typically there is a different dynamic than when a child kills one parent. So he said that in double parricide family systems, typically there's one main abuser, usually the father, which is true in this case too. But then the mother, or the secondary abuser, oftentimes she's either complicit in the abuse, where she doesn't do anything to stop it, and sometimes she is an abuser herself and has her own form of abuse that she inflicts onto her children. I think that's definitely true in this case.
That Jose was the primary abuser, and that Kitty was, although she was an abuser herself and she was complicit, she sort of was like the secondary abuser.
Yeah.
Now we should probably discuss psychological maltreatment that specifically was inflicted by Jose. So one aspect of this was that he would beat both the brothers with a belt, and this was corroborated by their cousin Alan Anderson, who would hear like the noise of the belt like being snapped and like used on the brothers, and then he would see bruises on them, right?
Yeah.
Back then, especially, like, certain disciplining of children was abusive was seen as more normal. And so when Jose did these things, it's not as if he thought, oh, okay, like, Alan's in the house, he's going to report me to the police, you know? So It's a lot easier for him to get away with stuff like that.
Yeah. I think Alan, in his testimony, said that he was, like, beaten with a belt at home, too. So I think he probably didn't, view it as abusive because it also happened to him.
Mm.
But, yeah, Jose would also, like, threaten the brothers with the belt and, like, put it on the table and, like, snap it to intimidate them with the threat of being beaten.
So another incident which would be evidence of physical abuse, is Jose punching Lyle in the stomach, and this was witnessed by Peter Cano, right?
Yeah.
Who was Andy's father?
Yeah, their uncle.
During the time that you were married to Marta, did you ever have occasion to stay at the Menendez home in Muncie, New York?
Yes, I did.
And this was the home of Kitty and Jose Menendez, is
Yes,
that correct?
ma'am. Yes.
And at the time you were staying there, were the boys small?
Yes, they were very small. We're going back to 1972 or 1973.
Did you have an opportunity to observe the interaction of Lyle and Erik and their parents?
Yes, I did.
And in particular, did you observe a situation in which Jose Menendez had a confrontation with his son Lyle Menendez?
Yes, we were having a family gathering, and Lyle was very restless and hyperactive. He couldn't sit still, so he was kind of running. And Jose shouted at him, "Stop!" And apparently he didn't hear.
Okay, now when you say apparently he didn't hear, was that because he didn't stop?
He didn't stop.
Now, normally when Jose yelled stop, would he stop?
By all means, yes, he would.
So on this occasion he didn't stop,
No, he didn't.
and what happened?
Well, Jose stood up, grabbed him, and just looked at him, and right in the eyes, and said something to him that I couldn't hear. And Lyle became incontinent. He wetted himself on the floor.
And how did he look when this happened?
He looked pale and trembling.
After that happened, you said Lyle looked pale. Did he look like, was he laughing? Did he look sad?
No, on the contrary, he looked very scared.
And what happened after that?
Well, after he became incontinent, his father took him to Lyle's room, and I followed him.
And did you go into the room?
Yes, I entered the room, and I kind of yelled at him. When I say him, at Jose's, because Jose was doing things that, according to myself, were way out of it. And Jose, in that instance,
Well,
hit Lyle
Okay. How did he hit Lyle?
with his closed fist,
Where did he hit him?
either on his chest or belly.
And Lyle would have been about 5 years old at this
Yes,
time?
yes.
And did Lyle cry out in any way?
I don't remember seeing him crying. He just, I don't know how, but he took it.
Did he hit him hard, or was he just fooling around?
No, very hard. In my estimation, very hard.
Is Jose a big man?
Big and strong.
And after you witnessed him hitting Lyle like this, did you say something to Jose?
I certainly did.
What did you say?
I cannot repeat the same things that I did say. I gave him a good piece of my mind, and I told him that was not the way to bring up a child. To which he responded that if I didn't like that, I could leave his house, that he could raise his children as he saw fit.
Did you leave his house?
Yes, I did.
He was one of the only people who actually witnessed physical abuse.
Mm-hmm. But didn't he only see it because he followed Jose into the room, right?
Yeah. But I mean, I think that's a perfect example of, like, you know, the brothers seeing that it was very rare for people to stand up to Jose, and that even if they did, it wasn't that Jose was going to stop doing what he was doing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think they learned very early on that other adults wouldn't do anything to help them.
Yeah.
Which I think that does sort of play into the events of the last week, actually. And why they thought that they didn't have any other options.
Yeah, I mean, if you've been maltreated and abused for your whole life, and any time that someone actually saw evidence of it, they were unable to stop it. Like,
Or look the other way.
yeah, how would you expect it to be any different when you're, 21 and 18? Another incident that Lyle testified to was one time he was roughhousing with Jose, and he grabbed Jose's genitals. And Lyle said that was something Jose did to him a lot. But when Lyle did it, Jose picked him up and threw him into a coffee table and gave Lyle a black eye, and he still has a scar on his right eye from that.
A photograph of it was shown during trial as well.
Yeah, of him with a black eye at age 7 or something.
Yeah, something about that incident that I thought was interesting as well, because I remember the way that Dr. Conti... Oh wait, no, it wasn't Dr. Conti, it was actually Dr. Stuart Hart. When he's asked about that incident during his testimony, the way he describes it is that Lyle was reciprocating or trying to engage his father in basically what his father had been doing to him. In a sexual way.
Are you saying you think Lyle construed the story differently in his testimony?
No, not necessarily, but it's probably something that he just doesn't like to speak about. Because you know how the sexual abuse was and the way they were groomed is that they were taught that it was a bonding experience between soldiers and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that would make sense why Lyle would do that to Jose. I think it probably is typical of an abuser like Jose that because it wasn't on his terms, it just sort of enraged him. And that's why he threw Lyle into the coffee table and became angry. In that moment, Jose wouldn't have had the power for that, those couple seconds. Jose was having something done to him.
Yeah. Another way that Jose was violent was he was violent towards their pets and animals in the house. Well, there were two main incidents, right? There was the rabbit and the dog. The rabbit, it was a pet that, a classroom pet, and Lyle had brought it home. It was the end of the year, we need someone to take this home. I don't really know. That's how he described it.
It was the end of 2nd grade. They gave away all the animals at the end of the year, and I managed to be able to get the rabbit. So they gave it to me in a box, and I brought it home. And I put it with... I tried to keep a lot of the animals I caught in the house for short periods of time, I had a turtle and so on. And so I put the rabbit in the empty aquarium that didn't have anything in. And I showed it to my mom.
What'd your mom say?
She liked it.
Did she subsequently tell you to get rid of the rabbit?
Yes.
And did you?
Actually, it was my mom said that my dad wanted me to get rid of the rabbit.
So were you supposed to find it a new home or something? Or just get rid
He
of it?
didn't care. She just said, Dad just wants you to get rid of it, so give it away. Or I couldn't take it back because school was out, so just give it away or let it go.
And did you do that? Did you give it away or let it go?
No.
And sometime later, did something happen to the rabbit?
Yes.
How much later after you were told to get rid of the rabbit?
A couple of days. I was basically hoping that they would change their mind with the rabbit, and then I noticed it was missing, and so I got very nervous, and I went to my mom and asked her where the rabbit is, and she said, well, you were supposed to get rid of it, so you have to talk to your dad. And I went into my dad, and he wouldn't answer me, and so I started to get very upset, and basically say, "Dad, tell me where the rabbit is." And I thought he let it go, and he told me that I was supposed to get rid of it, and that it was in the garbage.
Did you go check the garbage?
Yes.
What did you find?
He had beaten it to death, and it was just laying on top of the garbage, and there were flies. So I took it off, and we found one of the shoe boxes for it, and put it in the shoe box. And I got my brother, and we went out back to where we played with the army men, and I brought all my stuffed animals with me, and we buried it.
I think that incident is like really significant. I think it like shows a lot about the family dynamics and like the personalities of everyone in the family.
I think that was also probably one of the times when it demonstrated to Lyle the level of violence that his father was capable of. Isn't it like a big sign of like, is it like either antisocial personality disorder or like psychopathy if you harm animals, right?
Yeah. Although I'm not sure if that's like a sign of psychopathy of like when you're a kid if you do that, because I know like Jeffrey Dahmer would like torture and kill animals growing up.
Maybe it's specifically a thing for kids.
Yeah, like I think it's one of those things that's like a sign of it in your youth.
Like before the age of like 14 or something.
Yeah. So I don't know, but I think it does show, I mean, obviously his tendencies for violence.
And a complete lack of empathy, I think.
Yeah. I mean, a complete lack of empathy for the animal, but also for his son.
Yeah. I mean, but that wasn't the only incident of violence towards an animal, though.
This was something that Alicia Hertz, who was their neighbor when they lived in Pennington, talked about.
Like, she's spoken about it in interviews, right?
Yeah, she talked about it in the Truth and Lies documentary. So the family had these ferrets that ran around the house, and they also had dogs. And one day, one of the dogs killed a ferret, and then the next day, the brothers found the dog's head in the freezer. That Jose had, like, literally decapitated this animal and put its head in the freezer for his kids to find.
It reminds me of something that Lyle's Facebook page said. I think it was like, if a man can like cut off the head of his own dog, what else do you think he's capable of? I'd say like another thing that was quite significant in their psychological maltreatment, especially in their earlier years, was that prior to Jose wanting them to become tennis players, he wanted them to become professional swimmers, right? Because that's what Jose did before he left Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we'll delve more into this in a different episode when we actually discuss the sports at great length. But one way of training the brothers was that he thought he could increase their lung capacity by basically holding their heads underwater for extended periods of time. I'm not sure what the scientific basis for that was, but he was essentially just drowning them, which is, I don't know if you guys have ever not been able to breathe before or have been like almost choking on water, but like it's terrifying. And this was something that was seen by family members, and I think specifically Diane has spoken about this.
A lot of the brothers' physical abuse happened to them when they were kids, which I think is pretty typical. But Jose definitely continued to be violent towards the brothers into their, adult and teenage years.
Do you have another scar on your face below your lower lip?
Yes.
How old were you when you got that?
I was about 17, I think. I was in the I was at a club with a coach of mine, and we wouldn't play more than 5 minutes, and my dad pulled up in the limo. I had sprained my ankle, and so I had an ankle problem still, and I was playing with it. And so I just wasn't running as fast, and my dad was ridiculing me and pushing me and saying, you know, what a baby. Look, Brad, he can't run fast. Look at him. Look at him, oh, poor baby. Can't play tennis. Can't run. His ankle hurts. He was doing that over and over and over. And then finally, I was so embarrassed, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And I lost control, and I told my dad, why don't you just shut up? And
Had you ever said anything like that to your dad before?
no, never. And my coach was just like this, and I looked at him, my dad. You couldn't believe the transformation of my dad. He just turned red, and he didn't know what to do with himself. He grabbed the ball, and he threw it at me, and the ball hit me.
Could you have stepped out of the way?
Yes.
Why didn't you?
I wanted the ball to hit me.
Why?
Because I had screwed up, and I was hoping my dad he lost control there, and I wanted to just dissipate it. Maybe, you know, if he was going to throw a ball at me, I was going to make sure I got hit by the ball. So I got hit by the ball, and he told me to come over, and I kind of walked up to him. He led me over to the back of the car.
How did he lead you over to the back of the car?
He just grabbed me by the arm and led me. Didn't drag me or anything, because my coach was right there. And he put me in the back of the car. As soon as I got in the back of the car, he just punched me straight in the face. And I went back against the window, and he grabbed my neck. He said, don't ever embarrass me like that again, or I'll kill you.
What did you do?
Well, I didn't do anything. I just sat there. And I had blood all over my shirt.
I can't hear you. Move up. What I asked you what you did.
I was in shock. I didn't do anything. I nodded my head, and he tightened his grip on my neck, and he says, is that perfectly clear? And I said, yes.
Which again is something that would have added to not only Lyle's fear of Jose, but also just reinforced to him even more that if he did something out of line, or something that his father wasn't exactly happy with, then his father would have no problem at all getting rid of him.
Growing up in a household where there's so much unpredictability and violence, it kind of leads children to develop hypervigilance, which is where they are scanning the environment for like cues about different people's actions to like more easily anticipate violence or an attack. And the brothers definitely had that. Like, that was something that was developed in their brains through their childhood, and so it affected their relationship with their parents all the way through.
I mean, I think it's like you said to me earlier, like, if someone is willing to be physically violent against you, it just means that you could sort of expect that behavior even more so later on, because they've already treated you in this way previously. Why wouldn't they do so again? Or even worse.
Yeah, it's like the person is expecting violence, or like trying to interpret what behaviors are indicating that violence will be coming to them, because it's been a pattern that's existed throughout their whole life. You know, even when they're legally adults, that doesn't mean that they no longer have that psychology and that anticipation of violence from a parent.
I'd say like another big aspect of the psychological maltreatment was through the combined efforts of Jose and Kitty sort of working as a team against their children. A example of this would be the dinner table conversations, where essentially Jose would question the brothers, more so Lyle, about just random stuff, so like world events, history, stuff that like a kid his age probably isn't going to know. And if they got certain answers wrong, like they were berated and insulted, like called dumb, stupid. And I think the dinner table conversations are like another example of Kitty sort of being complicit and not doing anything to sort of mitigate Jose's belittling.
Lyle talked about how he would have to like report his whole day to Jose because Jose would be at work, and then he would come back and he would want to hear everything that happened in the day.
He would just start eating, and he would say, "So, how'd it go today?" And the ones I recall the most are the ones where it didn't even go so well. And I would say, "Oh, it went great, and I did real good today." And he would say, "That's not what I heard." I would say, "No, Dad, I did real well." And he would say, "Well, take me through the day." And I'd always start with getting up. I got up, I got ready. I did my stretching exercises before the day began.
What would you tell him about the stretching? Would you just say, I did my stretching exercises, or would you have to be more specific than that?
Usually whatever we had decided, like the day before or that week, we were going to stretch is what I told him. I can't remember right now, but if he didn't like what I was saying, he would say, "Well, let me see what you did." And I would get up and I would just show him basically how I worked my legs and my arms and my hip area and my neck, and went through the exercises or the specific ones that he wanted. And then he would say, "Okay, that's good. You can come back." And I'd come back, and he'd say, "Okay, what happened next?" And I said, "Well, I got ready and went to school." And always I would forget something, and he would say, "No, you just got ready and you went to school? That's it?" And I said, and I would usually remember, I would say, "No, I thought about my day first. I sat down like you said, and I thought about it." Sometimes it would be that I ate the foods that he wanted me to eat before, whatever it was. Usually it was like I thought about the day. He'd say, "Well, what did you think about it? You didn't just sit there and think about your day." I said, "No, I went, thought about concentrating at school, being polite. I thought about staying away from the other kids and thinking about what I was going to do after school with sports, and then what I was going to work on in the evening." And I basically went through all the things that I would normally say. And then he would say, "Good, good." And then I'd go through the day, and I'd say, "Well, then I went to school, and I had this first class," and he would usually say, "I don't want to hear about this school right now. Tell me what happened afterwards." And so I'd come back and say my mom picked me up, and we went to Sportorama, and I had my lesson, and he'd say, "Did you work on your backhand like we talked about?" I'd say, "Yeah." And my mom would be like in the kitchen somewhere, and during these conversations, occasionally, she would just make a noise and shake her head. She'd go, and my dad would grab me, and he'd yank me out of the table, and he'd just drag me down to the room, and he'd say I was lying. And I would be in the room, and then he would go, and he would punish me.
Did this happen every night at dinner?
Not like that.
Were you asked about your day every night at dinner?
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Yes.
I mean, I think that's a pretty blatant example of Kitty not only not protecting her children, but like actively putting them in harm's way. Like, she didn't have to say that Lyle didn't do something that day or indicate that he was lying, but she did.
I think this is very similar to do you remember the lists that Kitty would write?
Mr. Menendez, does this appear to be a list of 9 things?
Yes,
And who wrote that piece of paper?
I did.
And do you recognize what that piece of paper was for?
Yes.
And what was it for?
It was for my dad.
And what is it?
It's a list of all the things that my mother had me write down that I didn't do right.
On a particular day?
Yes.
And what was going to happen with that list?
She was going to give it to my dad.
Could you just read the top entry?
What Eric did.
And what's the first thing on it?
Number 1.
Yeah, I know. What is it?
At home, Eric would not eat on... I'm not sure what that word is. Would not eat on time or tape.
Okay. And number 2 is...
At home, Eric would not go to sleep or get his pajamas on.
And is it similar kinds of things all the way down?
Yes.
Now, when one of these lists of things that you did wrong was given to your father, what would his reaction be?
He would punish me.
And would the punishments vary depending on, well, whatever?
Yes. It depended how bad the list was. This list wasn't as bad.
As some?
Yes.
What punishment would you expect from this list?
This list, he would give me a long lecture, would probably slap me a couple of times, I don't know.
And this is not belt
No.
punishment list. Okay.
But this is also like similar to what you spoke about in the Paul Mona's book, right? About what the mother's role was usually like.
Yeah, it was like, I think the way Mona's described it was like the mother is actively informing on the children. I think most people would expect that if a father is abusive to both the mother and to the children, that the mother would be protective of her children and like try to prevent them from being abused. But Kitty did not do that and actively put them in abusive situations or did things knowing that they would be abused for it.
I mean, another aspect of like the dinner conversations though were like if Lyle got questions wrong, he'd be thrown outside, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty bad, especially since like that was when they were like lived in like Muncie and like those areas, right? Where the winters would be freezing cold.
Yeah.
One other part of the psychological maltreatment, specifically of Eric, is that he would frequently have nightmares. And correct me if I'm wrong, like, frequent nightmares are like a symptom of abuse, right?
Yeah.
And so he would frequently have these like night terrors. And what Kitty would do to like wake him out of them would be to put him in like a cold bathtub, right? And just drench him in water. Mm-hmm. This is not a healthy way to wake someone up from a nightmare. It's further psychological maltreatment.
One of Eric's night terrors or nightmares that he had throughout his life involved him being chased by someone with a green face.
How did the dream begin?
Well, the dream began with me just becoming real tiny, and everything just got larger and larger, and I felt like I was disappearing, and it was real. It was terrifying, and
and then that disappeared, and I went into a different state. I don't know how to describe it.
All right, well, what would happen with the green face? You'd start to be chased by this green-faced creature, and when would it turn into Dad?
Almost immediately.
And did you see other people in this dream that you knew?
Yes.
Who would you see in the dream?
Alicia, Sylvia, Anna Maria.
Who are they?
My relatives.
But
my
what
cousins.
about your aunts and uncles? Would you see them too?
No.
What about your mother? Was she ever in that dream?
Yes.
Now, would these other people, your relatives and your mother, show up during the part of the dream when you're being chased?
Yes, but at different points.
Okay. How did you run to people in this dream?
I ran to my relatives and asked them if I told them that Dad was chasing me and asked them if they saw Dad, and they would say no. And I would run. I ran to Lyle, and then he would suddenly abandon me and run away.
What about Mom?
I would run to Mom, but she was over the roof of the Pennington house.
In the dream, she was over the roof?
Yeah, she was sort of floating in the sky in the Pennington house.
So you couldn't get to her either?
No, I tried.
And how would this dream end?
With me falling off the roof in the Pennington house.
I mean, I'm not like a dream analyst, but I think that says a lot about what was on Eric's mind.
Wasn't he having the same nightmare in jail?
Yeah. An incident related to this of psychological maltreatment was that Eric would search his room before he went to bed for the green monster that was in his nightmares.
I would check every drawer, every closet underneath the bed.
Check for what?
Check for the monsters in my dream. Make sure there was nothing in there. There was no one hiding.
And did your mother get involved in this?
Sometimes.
And how did she know about this?
Well, because sometimes I'd be too scared to check it on my own, and I would want her there.
Had you told her about the nightmares?
Yes.
Had you told her about the checking?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall on an occasion when you wanted to do the checking that your mother was with you?
Yes.
Okay. Would you tell us about that occasion?
She was sitting on the bed, and I was going around to check the doors. I wanted her to do it, but she was saying, no, you do it. You got to be brave. You have to get old and be able to do these things yourself. And so I was checking the drawers, and I went to the closet, and I opened up the closet, the right closet, and this thing came down at me, and I jumped back.
What was the thing that came down on you?
It was a mask of a witch, this green mask.
And was that something you knew you had in the house?
No.
You had never seen it before?
No.
And what happened after the mask fell down from the closet on you?
My dad came out of the doorway and started laughing.
The doorway to your room?
Yes, he was apparently around the corner.
Hiding?
Yes.
And what did you do after your dad started laughing?
I just looked at my mom, and I was crying. I just ran out of the room.
Where'd you run to?
Downstairs into the room next to the door.
Did that room next to the door have a particular name?
It was called the green room.
And eventually, did you see your mother in the green room?
Yes.
And did she say anything to you while you were in there?
Yes.
What were you doing in the green room after you'd run out of your bedroom?
I was crying in the corner.
And what did your mother say to you when you saw her in the green room?
She said that she was sorry, but I had to be brave and had to get rid of these dreams and confront these dreams and to be strong, that I can't cry my way through this.
I mean, that wasn't the only time that they had teamed up to prank him or like done things like that to frighten him. I think there was another time that Eric had been with Kitty in the basement, and then she went up the stairs and turned off the lights and closed the door and left him in the basement. And then Jose had been like hiding in the basement, and he came up behind Eric and scared him, and then they both, turned on the lights and were like laughing at him.
I guess that ties in even more with why Eric would have seen his parents as a team, right?
Yeah.
What were the other aspects of Jose and Kitty sort of working as a team?
Well, both of them had their own ways of like punishing their children for what they viewed as failures. So Lyle wet the bed until he was 14, and when he wet the bed, they would Kitty would take the sheets and put them on the dinner table or something, right? To embarrass him.
Mm-hmm. And then both of the parents would laugh at him.
Yeah. They also would mock the brothers for stuttering, and for, I think it was Lyle had a problem with his walking, that they would mock him for that.
He still kind of has it as well. At the time of the trial, at least, he still had it, right? If you watch Lyle get up and start walking, he has this it's not like a limp, but it's because the way that Jose would make fun of it was that he would walk like a duck. Next time, you watch testimony and you see Lyle get up and start walking, you see that his feet kind of go out to the side. But yeah, apparently this is something that he was basically mocked for constantly by Jose. Do you think that was an actual medical problem that just was never seen to, or?
I mean, it could have been. I mean, they never brought any of these things to a doctor's attention.
From what we're aware of, at least.
I mean, it was never indicated in the medical records.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that was indicated in the medical records was Eric's hearing issue, right? Didn't they try to get him help for that after a long time?
Yeah, because it was brought to the parents' attention by school teachers, right?
Yeah.
And then he was recommended the Lewis School, which was a school that helped kids with some learning disabilities, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And since the teachers believed that Eric had dysgraphia, which was the way the teachers described it was that Eric, the physical act of writing for him was painful, and he also had other issues like dysnomia and other hearing issues, which the parents didn't necessarily seem like they were in a rush to fix those issues.
Yeah, and they also mocked Eric for not being able to hear them or not being able to understand them, things like that.
Yeah. I think Eric actually did have more of a stuttering problem in his earlier life than Lyle did, right?
Yeah.
At least that's what Lyle says in his testimony. What do you think is significant about Jose telling Eric, your mother's not your friend, she's mine?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because that was in the context of, or Eric interpreted that in the context of don't tell your mother about the sexual abuse. But I mean, I think it applies to just everything, just this whole, the entire family dynamic being that Kitty was always on Jose's side.
I think that again, if we're going to link that back to the last week, that would have just reinforced even more to Eric, especially. Mum's not going to do anything to help me. She's on his side. I mean, in that same vein, though, Jose was right, because Kitty would just report back to Jose everything that the brothers did.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if Jose had to tell Eric that, because Kitty's actions definitely demonstrated that she was Jose's friend and not her children's friend. And I mean, I think that's just another thing that makes it believable to me that she would allow Jose to molest their children for as long as he did.
Yeah. One of the witnesses who shows up in the first trial is Dr. Cox, who was one of Kitty's treating therapists in California, or when they first moved to California. But he shows up in Eric Tells All, and something he says I thought was really interesting. He said she realized that she was dating someone, or she was married to someone who was narcissistic, maybe even sociopathic, but her life was better with him, with all the money and the cars and the wealth, the big houses. Her life was better with him like that than what she envisioned it would be like without him. And so that would explain why, sort of like what you said, why she would continue to allow the molestation to happen and why she would have stuck on Jose's side. So we're going to be doing an episode specifically about the brothers' sports, so like their involvement in swimming and tennis. But something that we briefly wanted to mention is that the sports were an aspect of the psychological maltreatment where the brothers realized that the love of their parents was conditional and based on whether they succeeded or not in sports. And we'll expand on that later on, but I just thought it was kind of important to the psychological maltreatment aspect of the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, like, that Paul Mone's quote of, like, the parent who is killed by their child is the parent that views their child as an object and, like, for what the child can provide to the parent. So, you know, if the brothers knew that they were only important to their father for what they could give to him, and they were threatening to ruin all of that, then I think it makes perfect sense that they would fear that he would kill them because they were no longer valuable to him. So one element of the Menendez family system that was super important was how focused they were on their family image. I think this is pretty typical of, like, abusive homes, is that they try to hide the abuse, right? And hide, like, what's really going on inside the house. But I think in this family, it went beyond just trying to hide the physical abuse, and it was even more just how important the family, like, superiority was, and that like they were above everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of fed into the myths of the family and how Jose had always taught the brothers that they were better than everyone else, that their family, like, lineage, so like their ancestors as well, were like great soldiers and warriors, and that they were superior to other people. I think this is where, like, Jose's brainwashing actually is pretty key, and it reminds me of something from a book that Jose had Lyle basically memorize. And I think, didn't Lyle say in his, like, high school yearbook, like, that it was his favorite book? It was the greatest salesman in the world, right?
Yeah, he put a quote in his, like, yearbook page from that book.
Was that the quote about the sheep?
I can't remember what the quote was that he put in the book, but I know he talked about the sheep in his testimony.
That's the passage that we recited most often because it had to do with my ancestors. And that went that I was not born into this world in defeat, nor does failure course within my veins. And then it would go, I am not a sheep waiting to be prodded by my shepherd. I am a lion, and I refuse to walk and to talk and to sleep with the sheep. And I will hear not those who weep and complain, for their disease is contagious, and let them join the sheep.
I think that quote sums up perfectly how Jose tried to train his sons, and, like, how he taught them to view the superiority of their family. This comes under corrupting, right?
Yeah. Not only was it like that the entire family was superior, but specifically Jose portrayed himself as being this, like, all-powerful, like, commander kind of person. People were super intimidated by him. He was completely in control of everyone. And I think this whole, like, concept of the family superiority, I think, plays into why the brothers would think that no one would help them.
Yeah, do you think this sort of plays into why, like, they would have believed that their father was above the law?
Yeah. Like, if the brothers had never seen anyone stand up to their father, then, like, why would they think that they could trust anyone to get them out of the house and, like, that they would be safe from him?
I'd say, like, some corroboration for this comes from Diane as well. Like, Diane testified that when she stayed with the family, whenever they would go out to, like, public gatherings or dinners or etc., etc., she was basically trained and taught to present herself in a certain way, and she was told, okay, this stays in the house, you don't say this when we're outside, you don't mention this, and so on and so forth. So that sort of like demonstrates how the family were very keen on projecting a certain image to the outside world, and nothing from within the family or behind the scenes sort of got out, or they tried to not reveal certain things so that they could maintain the facade of the perfect family.
So, one of the 5 categories of psychological maltreatment is isolation, and that was definitely an effect in this family.
I think one really interesting aspect of this case is how the money is usually used as a way to suggest that the brothers killed for money, or the fact that they had money was a negative aspect or trait of the brothers. But I actually think the money in this case made their lives worse, because it gave the parents more power to isolate the brothers, and gave the parents more power in the sense that other people would see them as a wealthy family, like a privileged family, so that like they would turn the other way, because they would think, oh well, they're rich and successful, there's no way that like anything bad is going on. So I think that's a way in which the money was sort of used to isolate the brothers and turn certain eyes away from noticing that anything was wrong.
I think Dr. Conti talked about this in his testimony, that kids from poor families often have more access to things like social services, or, you know, if you're in a public school, then there's people around that are looking for signs of abuse or maltreatment. But because the brothers were wealthy, they didn't have those kinds of services around to the same extent, which I think also contributed to them not recognizing that there could be any help for them. This is something that's in the Paul Mohn's book, too, is one of the cases that he discusses. There was a girl who was sexually abused by her father, and she came from a wealthy family, and he talks about how the judge in that case said something to him about, like, oh, well, she was smart, had all of these resources available, like, she could have just left, which I think is very similar to this case of, you know, people viewing that if you have money, then that means that you have more access to opportunity to escape a situation, which I think to some extent is true, but in this case, money was still completely controlled by Jose, and just because they, you know, lived in a nice house didn't mean that that made it any easier for them to escape the control.
Yeah, and certainly at a psychological level, they still wouldn't have seen a safe way of escaping.
So one of the ways that Jose isolated the brothers was by teaching them that they couldn't trust anyone.
What was the lesson you were to learn about trust?
That you could not trust anyone. You shouldn't trust anyone. And that included your father. And if you did, then it's your fault, whatever happens. And that meant even if he had made promises, and I remember times when he'd be pushing me on the swing, and I'd say, Dad, you know, I don't want to go. It's scary if you go too hard, and he would say, oh no, I'm just going to push you if you don't, because I could have just swung myself and I asked him to push me, and so he was pushing me. And then he just started pushing me, so where the swing would get slack and then would come down on itself, and I caught my arm in the chain and scraped up my arm, bruised my arm, and I was crying, and I said, why? And I was crying, and he just said, I've told you, just don't trust people like that. Not even me. And there were other times too. There were other times when he would torment Erik with having him jump off things into his arms. And he'd say, come on, Erik. No, I'm going to catch you. Come on. And Erik would jump, and he would catch him. He'd put him back on all the high counters we had in the kitchen. He'd catch him and put him back on. And then one of the times he wouldn't catch him. And my brother would just fall face first, slam on the ground, and immediately explode into tears, cry. And my dad would just pretty much look at me, at least this is the times I remember, he'd look at me and says, you see, you just don't trust anybody. And I don't know if it's preparing me for life, and that's the sense I got, just preparing me for life.
Jose also isolated the brothers from really making friends, especially Lyle.
Lyle was basically trained to idolize his father from birth. So it's only natural how much he would have listened to his father and how much his father would have influenced them. And something that happened from quite an early point in Lyle's life is that his father taught him that, sort of like Maya said, with the whole image of superiority and being superior to other people. Lyle was taught that he was a winner, and that he didn't have time for friendships, and friendships were only there to distract him from succeeding in life.
They would have these talks in the basement where they would be sitting facing each other, and they would put their foreheads together, and then they would recite these passages from the book, The Greatest Salesman in the World.
And what is your earliest memory of talks in the basement?
Very early, 6 years old, when I was swimming. I would repeat phrases, and we'd basically go over the philosophies that were to correct whatever he didn't like that happened.
Give me an example.
Well, when I was playing soccer on the team with Mr. Gross, with this kid Jerry was playing, and his picture was on the wall at one point. And I believe I was 7 or 8. I'm not sure. And at one point I had a conversation with Jerry and his dad, and they were Jerry's dad usually pretty much always came to the games too, and he would take Jerry aside after the coach finished talking to everybody, and he would sort of laugh and talk with Jerry, and sometimes I wander over in that direction, and my dad would usually call me back, say, I want to talk to you, and we talked. One time Jerry's father came over and he grabbed me and said he wanted to talk to me about something. He wanted Jerry and I to get together and practice outside the team and do something. So he was talking to me about it, and I talked to him about it, and then the game resumed. And in the basement, my dad brought it up. He said, you were over talking to Jerry and his dad. Well, what did I tell you about having friends? I said, he just wanted to talk to me about practicing after Dad. I think it's a good idea. He said, no. What did I tell you about having friends? And then he'd say, let's go over it. And that's when we put our heads together. And that's when I would repeat to him.
What would you repeat?
Phrases from his books. And I would, that time I repeated, phrase, or I would just sit there and he would say, tell me what I told you about friends. And I would say, I have to constantly struggle because there are forces that tear me down, and sometimes they be disguised in the form of a smile or the hand of a friend.
Was that a quote from something?
It was a quote from the book. And he would repeat it, and I would repeat it, and he would repeat it, and then I would repeat it, and he would say, good.
How many times would you repeat it back and forth like that?
A couple times. That was the theme, that other kids weren't trained in the way I was. They didn't come from the same bloodline, and they had this disease of mediocrity, and it was contagious. And to stay away from, and that it was very tempting, and I was a weak person, and I seemed to be tempted for some reason to hang out with other kids, and I needed to remind myself, and so we worked on it.
In these talks, when your heads were together like that, if you said something that was a mistake, what would happen?
You know, he would bump my head.
Hard?
Not too hard, just enough. This was very trance-like. I usually had my eyes closed, and his forehead was on my head, and we would just repeat things in this voice. Sometimes his voice would get harder if he was trying to emphasize, or if he didn't like what I was saying, he would just bump my head like that, and I'd try to go back and do it again.
Yeah, it basically was brainwashing, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, like that, all of that plays into how Jose isolated Lyle from prying eyes and other people. I think it also ties in with how Jose objectified Lyle. Lyle was his, like, and only his, and other male influence in his life, like, weren't permitted. And like when we actually get to talking about the coaches, I think that will play into that a lot as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like another element of Jose's complete control over everything in the family, that he didn't want anyone else interfering with his property, you know. And like corroboration for this is that people saw Jose take Lyle into the basement or into another room, close the door, and they would be in there for hours with no one interrupting them.
Yeah. Wasn't a good example of that when Lyle was with Donovan and they went to, I believe it was Aunt Terry's house? And then when Jose was there, like, Lyle went down into the basement with Jose, and then Donovan was just there, but he was like kept waiting for a couple hours.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Donovan was Lyle's first friend, like first real friend in college, definitely the closest friend. And like Lyle had Donovan memorize passages from The Greatest Salesman in the World to like make Donovan a good enough friend to like be worthy of Jose's approval. And then when Donovan went to California with Lyle to meet Jose, he was grilled at the dinner table to see if he was, you know, good enough, basically.
And did you practice for this dinner table conversation?
Yes, we did.
How did you practice?
Well, he would play the part of his father.
He being Lyle?
Yeah.
And you would be you?
I would be me.
And how often did you practice before this dinner table conversation?
I can't recall how long we did it, but it seemed like maybe a little more than an hour.
And when Lyle was playing Mr. Menendez, what was the questioning like?
Oh, just background stuff and, you know, what I want to do, what I want to accomplish for the future and stuff. Nothing more than that.
And after you had this hour practice session to meet Mr. Menendez, was the actual meeting similar to the way the practice session had been?
Yes, it was.
In trying to recreate what you had experienced with his father, he made it a very intense experience. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And the actual dinner conversation with Mr. Menendez was in fact intense.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I think that whole situation as well just shows how desperate Lyle was, because he knew that his father didn't want like any sort of like male friends getting too close to him. And so when Donovan failed, that probably was pretty upsetting for him, because he knew that his father wouldn't allow that relationship to continue.
And I mean, thinking about sort of what we were talking about with Kitty, like, does it make sense that Lyle would plan out the murder of his father, who was someone that he completely idolized and, like, was trying to constantly win his approval and constantly doing things to please his father, like, and then he's gonna turn around and plan out a murder for no, like, with no inciting incident, you know? That just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Something that really stuck out to me was how one of the experts who evaluated Lyle, Dr. Hart, said that even to this day, so that would have been during the time of the trial, years later, years after his father's death, his father was still the most important person in his life to him. So it's kind of like, why would he have killed that same person? And I think we know why, but unfortunately a lot of people don't agree.
So, something we talked about at the beginning of this episode was how Jose treated his sons very differently. And one way that this showed up was that Lyle would be grilled at the dinner table about his day, but Erik wouldn't really be a part of that.
Would Erik be asked questions at the table?
Sometimes he would be asked questions. Most of the time he would try to answer a question or something, and my dad would just tell him to shut up. And he was very rough with Erik. Erik just sort of tried to get involved a lot, and that would really upset my dad.
Erik wanted your dad's attention?
He wanted to be part of what was going on. And he would just wander into the conversations. And sometimes my dad, I remember one time that he was in the black chair and I was by the coffee table and we were doing something, and my brother sort of just wandered into the area and my dad just hit him across the face. And my brother just went flying into the rug. And his whole face was bruised.
What was wrong with Erik? Why didn't your dad want to pay attention to him? Did your dad say, would he say things to Erik? What was wrong with him?
No, they would just tell him to shut up and go away. And why can't you just shut up and go away? Basically what I remember he would say. And my brother would just he'd just stand there. And my dad would have to push him away, or he would hit him. And then my brother would, like that time, just go crying and try to find his mother.
Did your mother ever come back and say anything to your dad about the way he was treating Erik or the way he was treating you?
No.
Overall.
Do you ever remember any time your mother interfering on your behalf with your dad?
I can't remember any time. Or with Erik in situations like that. In conversations where Dad was really grilling him and being harsh with him, making fun of him, sometimes my mom would intervene. but not when my dad was violent.
I think this kind of goes back to what we talked about in the first half of this episode, that Kitty also had a different relationship with each of her sons. She would sometimes stand up for Erik if Jose was being abusive to him or being rough with him, but she would never stand up for Lyle. And I think that is because she resented him and hated him, as she constantly told him throughout his life. Another way that the brothers were treated differently was that Erik wouldn't have these talks in the basement like Lyle did, but instead he had these mirror drills by Jose.
The mirror would happen a lot after sex. Sometimes it would just happen after I played tennis, or just when he got home and wanted to know how I practiced.
He would be drilling you, asking you questions?
Yes.
What the mirror have to do with his asking you questions?
Well, he would take my chair. I had a wooden chair, and he would take it and he would put it in front of the mirror, or he would have me stand up in the mirror. If it was after sex, I'd be doing it naked. If it was after tennis, I'd have my tennis clothes on. And he'd walk around behind me and ask me questions.
What kinds of questions?
He would say, "How did you feel today when you were on the tennis court? Did you feel you did well?"
And what would you say?
I would give my answer.
Well, hypothetically, give an answer so we can hear how this would go.
I would say, "Yeah, I think I played well." And he would say, "Wrong."
And now what was supposed to happen, if anything, when he said wrong?
I'd have to hit myself in the head.
You'd have to hit yourself?
Yes.
And what if you didn't hit yourself hard enough, or if you didn't do it, or if you missed? What would happen?
He'd hit me.
And where would he hit you?
In the back of the head.
And how long would these question sessions in front of the mirror go on?
Half hour.
And how many wrongs
Not sure.
typically would you hear?
I would hear, it depended on how stubborn there were times when I just couldn't take it anymore. It would just well up inside of me, and I couldn't stand it. And I knew the answer he would want after a while. I knew that if I was on the tennis court, he'd say, how did you play in tennis today? And I'd say, badly. And he'd say, right. And he'd say, how did you hit your forehand? I'd say, terribly. And he'd say, right. And he'd say, did you hit it down the line like I told you to? No. And he'd say, right. But sometimes he'd trick me once he knew that I was catching on to him, and sometimes I would just give the wrong answer on purpose.
Would you give a truthful answer? In other words, if you thought you played well, would you sometimes say, I played well?
Sometimes I would say I played well, but I knew I'd get punished for that.
You knew he'd say wrong?
Yes.
But you did it anyway?
Yes.
Because you had played well.
I had played well, and that wasn't really the reason. I just needed to defy him in any way I could.
Okay. And what would be the result of that kind of defiance?
I'd hit myself.
And how often would the mirror occur?
At least every week. Sometimes more. It really depended. It would usually happen on a Saturday and Sunday after I played tennis, or one time during the week after any sort of sex massage. It depended.
Now, you heard your brother Lyle testify that there were many, many occasions in his life when your father would take him to some part of the house, and they would sit down for hours at a time, and your father would lecture or drill your brother. You heard that testimony?
Yes.
Did your father ever take you to some part of the house other than your bedroom and give you similar lectures and drills to what he did to Lyle?
No, it would only be the mirror.
It would only be?
It would only be the mirror.
So the mirror was what he did to talk to you?
Yes.
And what about the dinner table? You heard your brother describe what he was put through at the dinner table. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And did that sound right to you? Is that what you recall happening at the dinner table to your brother?
Yeah, it was much worse than he described, but it was bad.
Much worse for him?
Yes.
And was it ever that bad for you at the dinner table as it was for him?
No.
Did your father do the same kind of questioning of you in front of the mirror that he did of your brother at dinner?
Yes.
I think this kind of plays into the isolation of the brothers and how Jose was trying to keep them isolated from each other as well as from outside influences, because I think he wanted them to know that they were viewed differently by him and that they weren't supposed to trust each other either. One thing that I think directly plays into the events of the last week was that throughout Erik's 12 years of sexual abuse from his father, he was pretty consistently threatened with death over revealing it. So sometimes these mirror drills that we were just talking about would involve Jose threatening Erik over revealing the sexual abuse.
I was sitting in front of the mirror. He used to do this every once in a while. I'd say at least once or twice. It happened more than just when I was 13. And I would sit in the chair in front of the mirror, and he would ask me if I've told anyone, and I said no. And he would say, "What's going to happen to you if you tell anyone?" And I remember the first time I said that you will hurt me, and he said wrong, and so I hit myself. And he said, "What's going to happen if you tell someone?" And I didn't answer. And he said again, he said, "What is going to happen if you tell someone?" And I said, "You'll kill me." And he said, "Right."
And that happened more than once?
Yes.
Now,
I got it right the second time, though.
Excuse me?
I would learn how to get it right, the answers.
So the second time, what was your answer?
Just that he'll kill me.
And then he said, right?
Yeah.
And this was sort of done to reinforce the fear and to make sure that Erik would never say anything. Something that Erik says is that his father told him, "If you ever tell anyone, I'll tie you to a chair and beat you to death." And in Erik Tells All, Erik recalls being told that his father would show him what the inside of a skull looked like, and sort of implying that it would be his skull.
And I mean, this is entirely consistent with Jose's character.
Mm-hmm.
And it also makes sense why, when Erik did tell, he would be so fearful.
I think one other example of this as well is when there was the incident when Diane was staying with them and Erik had attempted to run away from home. I believe he was 12 at the time, right?
Yes.
Yes. So Erik had left and then had taken like a small boat or a canoe across the lake that was behind the house and into the forest. He ended up getting lost, and it was becoming nighttime. And then when Jose found him, Jose put him against like a tree and said something to the effect of like, "If you ever try and run away again, I'll kill you. You hear me? If you ever try that again, I'll kill you." And I mean, like, sort of to conclude this is that I think if you've been told repeatedly for 12 years, "If you ever say anything to anyone, I will kill you," I don't think it's that big of a surprise that when Erik did tell someone, that he was genuinely afraid. Okay, so even though the brothers did end up having a pretty close relationship, and Lyle was eventually sort of like Erik's protector and the person who was probably the most concerned about Erik, their relationship wasn't always like that, and in the earlier years, Lyle was more of a bully towards Erik. this was mostly caused by his father, who would, like, forcibly have them get into fights, or would egg Lyle on to fight Erik, basically just to bully him, right?
Yeah, I mean, Jose would, like, pitted them against each other. I think mostly physically, and, like, physical fights, and fostering their competitive nature against each other. Which I think is also an element of isolation, in that he was trying to keep the brothers from having a close relationship. And out of all the things he did, that was one that failed miserably, because they did end up having a very close relationship.
I think it had the opposite effect, because Lyle had treated him badly in the early years, that in turn made Lyle feel probably guilty, which then caused him to become more protective of Erik later on.
Yeah, do you remember that section of Erik Tells All where Erik is talking about Jose would have them, like, hit each other's pressure points and inflict pain on each other?
One of the things that my dad would do, he would show us the pressure points, and he would have Lyle do the pressure points on me, and it would hurt. And he would have Lyle continually do it, even though I was, in pain. I wouldn't be able to vocalize the pain. One time, he felt Lyle was holding back on him. Told Lyle harder, harder, and Lyle whispered, "I'm sorry." And I screamed out. Lyle stood up and balled his fist and said to Dad, "No." Dad smacked him across the face, and then he said something that to this day has always resonated with me. He said, "I didn't raise you to get weak because you feel another person's pain," was the theme that you don't. And him hitting Lyle was something that he did not just in front of me, but he did routinely. And he knew that we weren't going to talk about it to each other. The stress and the pain in the household was a secret that we didn't share with each other. And that was very big. He made sure that the things that happened to me, they didn't get to Lyle. And the things that happened to Lyle, Lyle didn't share with me. So there was that sense of isolation.
Yeah, it is interesting that they ended up becoming really close. Like, do you think that Jose knew that they were becoming close and just decided that he wasn't going to try to keep them separated? Or
I actually think that Jose didn't know they were as close as they were. The reason why I say that is because as we've mentioned before, the parent that was with them, like, of the vast majority of the time was Kitty, right?
Yeah.
Jose was away a lot. So I think, like, when he was around the family, the brothers sort of reverted to, like, obeying his orders and being seemingly, like, kind of isolated. And whenever Jose was doing anything to Erik, I think Lyle himself said that, like, he would never step in or do anything if it was his father. He would only step in if it was his mother, right?
Yeah.
So I think that probably reinforced to Jose that, oh, okay, like sure, they might hang out sometime, like, on the weekend when I'm not here, but they're probably not that, like, super close. So I think that's probably why Jose didn't really fear that Erik would ever tell Lyle anything.
Yeah, because there was that incident that both brothers described where they were playing tennis and Erik did something wrong and Jose, like, lifted him up and threw him against the fence.
Okay.
So he just grabbed me and lifted me up onto the fence a few feet off the ground and ripped my shirt. And Lyle came running over. And he wasn't going to interfere with Dad, but he just said, it's okay, calm down, quietly behind Dad. Dad didn't hear me.
He's making this gesture to whom?
To me.
To try to calm you down?
Yeah, I was crying.
And why do you think he was trying to calm you down?
Because he loved me.
Objection sustained. The answer's true.
Would your father react in a certain way if you were crying versus if you weren't crying when
Yes.
he was angry?
Yes, if I wasn't crying, it wouldn't be as bad. And so he was trying to get me to stop crying so Dad wouldn't.
Okay. And what happened after that?
Dad threw me in the basement and just lectured me. Nothing really happened that bad.
And why does this stick out in your mind? Why is this so significant that your brother did this?
Because the incidences where my brother helped me, either with other people or with my mom and dad, just really stick out in my mind. I don't know why.
But I think that kind of goes to your point that, like, Lyle was doing that out of Jose's vision. That, like, he was never going to intervene between, in, like, a physical way between Jose and Erik, but he was trying to protect Erik from, like, the outside.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that also plays into Jose's reaction when Lyle actually confronted him in the last week? Like, why Jose seemed to Lyle to be unbothered? Because, like, Jose looked like he was going to be physically violent towards Lyle, right, at first, and then he sort of, like, backed down, right, or backed off a little.
Yeah. I don't think Jose expected Lyle to threaten him over Erik.
Mm-hmm.
Because he didn't realize how much Lyle cared about Erik. And so when he actually did threaten Jose, I think that was when Jose realized that he had lost control over Lyle and that Lyle was more willing to defend Erik than he thought.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So that's a pretty good sort of overview of what we think are some of the most fear-inducing elements of the brothers' psychological and physical abuse. A lot of this kind of information was not presented in the second trial for a variety of reasons. One was that Lyle didn't testify, and another was that psychological and physical abuse from their childhood was not allowed in as testimony, right?
Yeah, it was ruled as irrelevant because it wouldn't have necessarily added to their fear on the night of the shooting that their parents were going to kill them.
A new lead prosecutor, David Kahn, successfully blocked many of the defense witnesses from the first trial. The parade of teachers, family, and friends who had described the relationships within the Menendez family. The first prosecution team had accepted that these witnesses were relevant. Kahn now rejected that logic, and Judge Weisberg agreed.
He decided only those things that were operating on their conscious minds that week was admissible. Well, that's ridiculous. The unconscious mind probably dictates more of our feelings than the conscious mind. That was just an arbitrary ruling.
What the judge was able to do was to keep out a lot of trivia, but mountains of trivia, and that was very important. It kept the jury from being distracted from the real issues in this case, which were the defendant's state of mind at the time of the commission of the crime.
But I mean, I think, like, what we tried to cover in this episode was to sort of show how it did affect them, like, all the way through their lives.
Yeah, and why it would have been important to their defense.
Yeah.
I would also say as well, like, if you're interested in really hearing more about specifically, like, this aspect of their defense and the psychological maltreatment, you need to watch the testimony of the psychological experts. So Dr. Stuart Hart, Dr. Ann Tyler, Dr. Ann Burgess, and Dr. John Conti. They're very important.
Yeah. And those experts weren't allowed in the second trial either.
I think Dr. Stuart Hart testified in the penalty phase. But yeah, in the, like, case in chief, they weren't permitted.
I think that cutting out the psychological abuse evidence from their childhood was significant in them being convicted.
The way I see it is, I think when you cut out all of the psychological abuse and all of the psychological maltreatment evidence, I think that also probably removes some of the reasonable doubt that jurors would have had if they had heard that evidence.
Yeah. Like, I think the entire dynamic of the family explains how the events of the last week that the brothers testified about would make sense. And I think without the psychological testimony, it seems less believable because it doesn't explain how they would have felt the way that they felt.
And why they would have been afraid as well.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. We really appreciate your support. Our next episode will be on the events of the last week and what the brothers say led up to the killing of their parents. So we hope you look forward to that one.